Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I am delighted to be joined by Lisa Fagin Davis, who is a paleographer, a historian, a scholar, and of course, the executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, the largest association of medievalists in the United States, and correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps in the world as well.
Indeed.
Indeed,
Yes,
it is.
in the world.
That's what I was thinking. So, the U.S. leading the way, oftentimes in bad ways nowadays, but, I like to think at least we have a lot of medievalists around and about. She's also a scholar, I should say, of the mysterious Voynich Manuscript, which we will, I'm sure, talk about in a little while, because I have been reasonably assured that you have cracked the code and you will reveal all of the secrets on the Voynich on this episode.
I have all the answers. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. That's right. If that doesn't sell this episode,
Don't change that channel.
That's right. If that doesn't sell this episode, nothing will. So, but thank you again for joining us, Lisa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. I'm thrilled to be here.
Fantastic. So, as I'm sure you've listened to the podcast, you mentioned before, and so you know that we like to start with perhaps like kind of a silly question, but again, like we deal in time machines sometimes as scholars, people who work on the past. So my question is, of course, about time machines. And this question, however, is about our relationship to time machines. So if we had a time machine, just in our imaginations, we have a time machine right here. It has been given to you, Lisa, and you get to go back and tell a childhood version of yourself that you grew up to be a medievalist. How does childhood Lisa react to that news?
Childhood Lisa is very sad because childhood Lisa was big into fantasy literature and Lord of the Rings and I mean the sci-fi as well, but those things are things that I always loved. But in terms of my life, I was definitely going to be a professional actress and musical comedian. That was my plan all along.
Okay. All right. So musical theater specifically.
Yes, 100%. Yes. I did professional shows. I did commercials. I was sort of a professional kid in many ways.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we have to learn a little bit more about that maybe in a minute, though.
Okay.
I find this question really kind of interesting because like 50% of the people I talk to are like, when I ask that question, what do you think about like growing up to be a medievalist? They're like, oh yeah, no, that totally made sense for like these various reasons. And then 50% of people were like, I would be so depressed, Matt. So to realize what my life has become, which maybe tracks for most academics generally, but it just
do we all regret our life choices? Is that?
I mean, of course we do, right? So
No, I'm thrilled at where I've landed. I love the work that I do. I love being part of the Medieval Academy and the larger ecosystem of medieval studies. It's a good place to be.
I mean, not a huge leap, I would say, probably from musical theater or Broadway, like the performativity of it, right?
Sure.
I mean, to kind of scholarship kind of generally, or academia kind of generally, but then medieval studies as well. Lots of kind of those types of things. I mean, when David and I released our most recent book, Oathbreakers, we were on a musical theater podcast because they wanted somebody to talk about Pippin.
Nice.
That great 1970s theater, which I mean, that's just, it's so fun and so interesting. But did you have a favorite kind of play growing up or something, a part that you particularly kind of loved performing?
I played Annie Oakley in Annie Get Your Gun.
Really? Okay. All right.
That was big. Problematic. There's a whole problematic Native American piece of Annie Get Your Gun. But yes, that was fun. Yeah, I grew up in Oklahoma, so I grew up a rifle woman. I did a lot of target shooting, never hunted, but I enjoyed target shooting. And so playing Annie Oakley was fun for me. I enjoyed that a lot.
Okay. I mean, when the winds come whipping down the plains, I mean,
It's Oklahoma, man.
it's
That's who we
Oklahoma.
are. We are all
That's
about
right.
Rodgers and Hammerstein. That's just who we are.
That's right. And, as every scholar knows, like lots of kind of problematic kind of issues, right? With some of the
Yes,
older artistic and, scholarly material as well, right? From that
of
period that we
course.
have to kind of confront and should confront and understand as a product of its time, but not to excuse its behaviors, but to understand it within its context.
But that's one of the reasons why being a medievalist right now is really
Mm,
fantastic, right? We're doing that work. We're kind of deconstructing what medieval studies is and rebuilding it in a way that is more capacious and more diverse and more inclusive,
yeah.
more capacious and more generous. And I think that's really exciting.
That was always weird to me. Like when I was in grad school, I did my PhD at Berkeley. And we had to take a historiography course. Historiography, if you're unfamiliar, kind of study of the way that people have studied the past, and I thought it was really cool and it was really interesting. And it was always pitched to me as like, oh, you're going to have to take this course and it's going to be terrible and boring. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. Like this stuff's super interesting.
Mhm.
The way that we have studied the past. I mean, my scholarship is basically how medievals kind of thought about the past generally
Yep.
too. So I've been doing historiography the whole time. But yeah, I think it's really fun and interesting. And to think about not just how our colleagues today are thinking about, in our case, predominantly, but not exclusively, of course, the European Middle Ages, but how people in the past and how that shaped our understanding of that particular period or that particular object
Mhm.
or typology, right?
Right, and being someone who studies the primarily European Middle Ages in North America
Mm.
is a whole
Oh,
other
yeah.
can of worms, right? And so fascinating to me to think about, first of all, the United States has more medievalists than any other country,
Hmm.
and that's weird.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it tells you something about how we have perhaps too many institutions of higher education. But also, there are a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic who are really interested in that time period on the other side of the Atlantic. And I find that really fascinating. And also the fact, I mean, my scholarship has primarily had to do with medieval European manuscripts in North America,
Hmm.
how they got here, where they are, why are there manuscripts in Iowa? Why are there manuscripts in Kansas or Oklahoma or anywhere for that matter? How did they get here and who brought them here? And those stories I find really exciting and engaging.
Well, as the host of a podcast entitled American Medieval, I too find those stories very interesting, as you may expect. And this is a good way to kind of maybe transition. Is so your scholarship is related to the collection of manuscripts, the transmission of manuscripts, but also kind of terms that we as professionals say paleography and
Mhm,
codicologies. So could you
mhm.
kind of explain, just for our readers who maybe are unfamiliar, kind of what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to study manuscripts as opposed to somebody who is maybe different and studies kind of artistic production or scholarly editions of written texts or something like that?
Yeah, when I tell people that I'm an expert on manuscript studies, on medieval, the study of the book as an object, sometimes what I get is, "Oh, so you translate them?" Like, no, honestly, I don't even read them for the most part. It's not like I'm sitting
Yeah.
here and I'm cataloging a manuscript of, I don't know, Livy,
Hmm.
and I love Livy, like everybody who doesn't love Livy, but I'm not sitting there reading it from start to finish as part of my work. My work is to engage with the object. How is it structured? How many people wrote it? How many different hands? When and where was it written? And how the heck did it get from where it was 800 years ago to where it is today? Those are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. There are plenty of people who will study the text.
Sure.
I'm not as interested in the text as I am in the carrier of the text.
In the book itself, right?
Right,
In
the
like the
object.
physical, the
Yeah,
physical object. Yeah.
yeah.
I've only kind of dipped into that a little bit in my own research, not quite in my dissertation, but in the research, kind of turning that dissertation. And this is something that a lot of scholars kind of do, is that they do a kind of body of work during their dissertation, and then they transform it into kind of a book project kind of afterwards. And there's lots of different types of ways that it needs to be changed, that a dissertation is different than a book. But one of the things was I had to do a little bit more archival work. So I went to
Mhm.
France and I had to learn, like, I had a little bit of kind of education in this way, but in most American graduate programs, there's not a lot of training in manuscript production and the methods of manuscript production. But I was trying to find one specific text and how it was sewn in to a manuscript, which led to a very embarrassing for me story about trying to communicate in French about why a microfilm wouldn't do and why I actually needed to see, see the manuscript.
Right.
I had to learn all sorts of really specialized French terms for, stitching and folio and stuff like that, which I don't even remember nowadays. But
yeah, I know I had a similar experience doing research in France where I had this incredible revelation while I was looking at a manuscript that the text was out of order. And, I sort of jumped out of my chair. I was trying to explain to the gentleman across the table from me in my broken French exactly what it was. It was not easy to make myself understood.
No. But, we muddle. Yeah.
It's that almost miracle of survival that any of these objects have even made it out of the Middle Ages alive.
Yeah.
Right. And some recent work that others have done, some statistical extrapolation, has calculated that the survival rate of medieval manuscripts is only about 10% at the most. There's so much that's fragmentary or that's lost in fires and war and floods and, catastrophe, that the written record that we have is just the tiniest fraction of what once existed. And so it can be tempting to say, well, so the Voynich Manuscript, it's the only one, therefore there was never anything like it. And you can't say that.
Yeah.
There could have been 50 manuscripts like it, and they just didn't survive.
Yeah.
And so you always have to keep that question of survival in the back of your head when you're trying to do this kind of work. All we can do is work with the record that we have, but we always have to have sort of some cautious caveats and saying, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah. It's a terribly frustrating thing because when outside observers, and for lots of reasons, I mean, the myth of the Dark Ages, as you and I both know, still persists.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, not just a kind of about brutality and barbarity and stuff like that, but about kind of literally from its origins, about a period without sources, right? And, stereotypes about declining literacy, and there was kind of overall declining literacy, of course, in the early Middle Ages and things like that. But the reality is like, we just don't know kind of what was out there. And even beyond that one statistical study that you were referencing, every medievalist has a manuscript or a text that was lost in World War II or lost in a fire or something like that, right? Like everybody, because we have all these catalogs and we can't necessarily even match up and know where every manuscript that's listed in a 12th century catalog from a monastic abbey or a monastic library ended up going. Like we just don't know where they were.
Right. And unfortunately, so I'm a professor of library science, among other things. I teach at Simmons University in their library science program. And one of the things we talk about a lot is the history of cataloging, the history of description, and how it has developed over the years and why it's important. And, one of the points I always make is that manuscript description, which is intended to be fairly objective, is not. It's not neutral. You're always making choices about how you describe who the author is, what their gender might have been, right? Where there's a lot of assumptions that people make, and you have to be really careful when you're describing an object. You're assigning it a subject classification. That's not a neutral.
No, it's not.
Act. It is the opposite of neutral. It is completely subjective. And we talk about how in, say, the 12th century, you might have a monastic library where they've just listed the books. It says 15 Bibles and 5 antiphonals, and here's a copy of Ovid, and we might have had, whatever it is. But those descriptions are never sufficient to identify them with an exact object today, right? They're just not. There's not enough information. We need to know. You want to know how many leaves there were, or was it really big, or was it really small? Even something like that. Like, this is a really big manuscript, and it has 372 leaves. So that's helpful. But without that kind of information, we are in the dark, as it were.
In the dark, unfortunately.
You see what I did there?
Yeah, I did see that. Yeah, that's good. More puns, please. So
okay.
we have had not enough puns on this podcast. So we definitely need more. I remember one time, like you were talking about kind of these descriptions, like especially in medieval catalogs, the ones that I've spent kind of some time with, monastic, especially kind of 11th and 12th century ones, because I'd
Yep.
been for a scholarly project, not Oathbreakers and Bright Ages, but for my more recent academic book, is I was trying to track down biblical commentaries.
Hmm.
And it would often be like some of these things would be like one copy of Augustine.
Right.
What
That's helpful.
Augustine, man? That dude
Which-
wrote so much. Like, what
Exactly.
are you talking about? Like,
Which Augustine is it? Right?
Yes.
Exactly. There are so many possibilities. It could be, are we commenting on John? Are we commenting on the
Yep.
Psalms? There are all sorts of directions we could go.
Yes, the city of God is like, to the monks of Echternach in the 11th century or whoever it was, right? Like, it's just like, oh yeah, that's the Augustine volume.
Right.
Yeah, we all know that that's the one. But like, to me, it's just like, come on, man, help a guy out. Like,
But this is also why the study of manuscript fragments can be really important, right? This is a more recent piece of my scholarship, is that I'm really, really interested in collections of manuscript fragments, again, in North America, and their sources and what happened to them. How were they fragmented? Sometimes it's just it was cut up for use in a binding to support a medieval binding, like recycling precious material. So you don't have to kill another animal. You just recycle some old parchment. So that's, we can't really judge people for that. But as we move towards modernity, you get people like Ruskin cutting out initials out of manuscripts and gluing them onto pages and framing them on walls. And then when you get to the 20th century, we get the worst of it, which is the biblioclasts like Otto Egge, who literally took entire manuscripts, cut them into pieces, and sold them off page by page at an enormous profit. Quantities, economies of scale. And so these things have ended up everywhere. And so that's a whole new source of scholarship. There's so much work to be done on these fragmented objects and what we can glean from them once we start pulling the leaves back together in a digital space. There's quite a lot we can learn about these manuscripts and sort of help fill in the record of all of this material that's been lost.
Yeah. No, and I'm wondering if you could talk like a little bit more, because I want to talk about the digital reconstruction, which is the digital tools, I should say, that are available to us to do this type of reconstruction is really could potentially game changing for a lot of the ways that we understand this period, and not just kind of the book, but kind of the wider kind of cultural and social impact that these books kind of represent or can show us. But you mentioned kind of earlier is about how did these books get here in the first place? You mentioned kind of the biblioclasts, like people kind of cutting things up. But I think a lot of people are probably curious. I mean, like I'm sometimes curious, like why are there manuscripts in Iowa or in Oklahoma and places like that? Like because they didn't start there and somebody brought them there. So like, what are some of the stories that you can tell us or tell our listeners like about kind of that process of manuscript translation? Understanding, of course, this would take a whole like another hour to and more to go through it, right? So
well, yes, and it is, and a shameless promotion here. I would direct everyone to head for my blog, to the Manuscript Road Trip blog, where I go through state by state and have written a blog post about every single state in the Union and where the manuscripts are, and tell some of these stories about how they got there. And I did it in sort of geographic order, as if I was literally driving around the United States. And that was kind of the conceit of the project. And it got to the point where, a friend in Madison emailed me and said, "You were in Wisconsin? Why didn't you give me a call?" Like, no, I was not actually in Wisconsin, but I'm such a great descriptive writer that you thought I was actually driving down the highway headed for Madison. And so on my blog, I've actually written about every single state. I could not find manuscripts in Alaska.
Okay.
I don't know of a single manuscript, not even a single page. And only last year, we finally found one in North Dakota. And that polished off the lower 48. And it's like when you look for license plates from all the states.
Yes.
I'm collecting manuscript.
The license plate game, the manuscript game. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. From every state. Finally nailed North Dakota. That was pretty exciting for me. I could add that to my heat map. But so like there was an actor in the 1920s named Gareth Hughes who was gay and very much like a darling in silent movie era Hollywood. And he was closeted. It was the 1920s.
Sure, yeah.
But he was known to have this kind of scandal-filled, partying, playboy kind of life. And he was really into the Gothic aesthetic. If you look at pictures of his home, it looked like Hearst Castle decoratively.
Sure.
It was, just sort of decorated with this pseudo-medieval stuff. But he also collected manuscripts.
Okay.
And after the stock market crash, he had some kind of a spiritual awakening because he couldn't make money in Hollywood anymore, and he became a monk. And he was sent on a mission to the Paiute in Nevada, to the reservation there, where he lived for years and years. He brought all his manuscripts with him. And after he died, all the manuscripts ended up at the University of Nevada in Reno. Nevada.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
There are manuscripts in Reno. And so, and one of them I was actually able to track all the way back to its origins in France, where it was like looted by the Huguenots. And, it had this whole journey till it finally ended up in Reno. Imagine you go into Vegas. There are no manuscripts in Vegas. There's Excalibur. I heard you talking with Megan about Excalibur, which honestly is one of my favorite places. That jousting experience at Excalibur is a really good time. It's extraordinarily silly, but it was really fun. I dragged my husband, who is not a medievalist, but he's used to me dragging him around to things like that. But anyway, so that's how that manuscript got to Nevada. And every single manuscript in North America has a story like that. They all traveled, whether they came here legally, sometimes they got looted, they might have fallen off a truck in Cairo. There are all sorts of ways that they get here. And for manuscripts that are not from Western Europe, it's even more of an obligation as a cataloger to figure out how they got here, because they often have the least recorded provenance, because somebody in the 1920s might go to Cairo and there's a guy on the street selling ancient manuscripts. And so they just scoop them up and bring them home. And no one knows where they came from. No one knows how they got here. That sort of ties in with medievalism in that there's this exoticization that happens of non-Latinate scripts.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Where people want to collect, ooh, look at this. It's in Persian. How exotic, right? And that's a little problematic as well, for sure. One of the things that I'm always telling my library science students is that how important that is in particular. If you have a manuscript in front of you and you can't read the script, then you are obliged to find someone who can tell you what that thing is. There is almost always going to be somebody, if you're at a university, there's going to be somebody on campus who can read, Cyrillic characters, or who can read Persian, or who can read Arabic, who can then tell you what exactly this thing is. We can't let them languish unidentified. It feels like a moral imperative to me. It's almost a reparative act.
I mean, is it true, though, that just kind of generally is that, because this is my impression, and I could be totally wrong in this, and please tell me I'm wrong. You will join a long chorus of people telling me I am, Matt, you are wrong. But is that most of the manuscripts that wound up in the United States are 20th century transfers, right? Was there a lot of collecting in the 19th century? And part of that, I think, of course, has to do with the Medieval Academy of America, the professionalization of the discipline as a whole, but also kind of the ruptures that happen in Europe, at least for kind of Latin manuscripts as well, like in the 20th century, like I remember stories, I certainly know of stories myself, of kind of wealthy Americans going over in the 20s and 30s, and then immediately after World War II, going to poor places that just needed a lot of money and just say, I'll take all those manuscripts off your hand for a pittance.
Absolutely. That's, you think about J.P. Morgan. He's sort of the best example. He's got Belle de Costa Green buying up anything they can get their hands on, especially after World War I, just scooping it all up and sucking it over to the United States. And the Europeans were not real happy about that. They were a little bit cranky to see their patrimony being shipped off across the ocean. But all of those trends, right? So the professionalization of medieval studies, the fetishization of the Middle Ages, plus all the robber baron money, all of those things kind of come together in this perfect storm in the early 20th century to bring hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of books and manuscripts across the ocean to settle in either private collections, and the private collections eventually make their way into public collections through bequests and sales and things. There aren't a whole lot of major private collectors anymore. Nobody can afford it. Their manuscripts, they're pretty pricey right now, but something you could get for $100 100 years ago is going to set you back $1 million today.
Yeah.
So that puts a damper on the excitement of it all. I own some leaves. I have a few manuscript leaves hanging on my wall, but they're all have a known provenance. I would not buy something if I didn't know when it was dismembered. There are still people cutting up books today.
Yeah.
And you really don't want to buy something that was whole last week and that's in pieces today.
Yeah.
It's like ivory, right? It's like buying elephant ivory. If it was sourced 300 years ago, that's ethically a different question than if it was sourced yesterday.
And still a lot of money, unfortunately, kind of in the black market for that. I remember kind of hearing your stories about people stealing manuscripts from major collections in Europe and then taking them home, cutting them up and selling them. There's certainly a market for that, right? And
for sure.
You said, like those leaves cost money. And
the more research that gets done on manuscripts, the more we find out about their provenance. I worked for several years at the Boston Public Library, which has one of the largest collections of pre-1600 manuscripts in a public collection in the U.S. I worked there for several years cataloging their manuscripts. They have 300. It's a very large collection. And I discovered that one of them had been stolen during World War II.
Really?
From the National Archive in Venice. And so I actually ended up being a consultant to the government, which I'm sorry to say turns out to be the Department of Homeland Security that does these kind of investigations. So I was, in fact, on the DHS payroll about 15 years ago. I'm not anymore. And they hired me to do a very formal process of research and discovery. There are lawyers and treaties and, it's this whole process. And then the manuscript was voluntarily repatriated and sent back to the National Archive in Venice, which was pretty exciting. I felt really good about that. And I was able to actually see it there when I was in Venice a few years ago. And I was very emotional.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, I might have cried, but I'm pretty emotional that way. It was really a lovely thing to send it home.
No, I mean, that's kind of amazing, right? It's just to say like, I did that and it's back where it should be, right? Like it was illegally gotten. So yeah, I mean, a lesson for museums. I'm not thinking of any in particular, about, repatriating stolen objects. No, not at all. So nothing I'm going to mention on air, definitely. So
they tried to hire me too, and I turned them down.
Did they really? Oh,
they did.
Okay.
They did.
Wow.
Yeah. And I didn't. My husband said I should take their dirty money and use it to support reproductive care. But it's not a bad idea.
No, I mean,
support causes that they don't like.
Yes, I mean, I think about that sometimes when I get a tax refund from at certain times of the year, and I know what I do with that tax refund. So.
Yeah, but anyway, so I have had those experiences where
sure.
Either I've discovered something about a manuscript that was problematic, or and then in this other case, I just turned down the job offer because I really didn't want to work for them.
What about fakes? Have you encountered any kind of problems with, certainly because this is a big business and it has been a big business, right? Like gullible Americans going over and buying things that seem legit, but maybe aren't. So
I mean, the biggest perpetrator of that is the Spanish forger who was working in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he apparently bought a huge choir book, one of these really giant manuscripts, cut it up, and then cut the sheets into squares of authentic medieval parchment on which he would paint what were meant to look like medieval miniatures, which he would then frame. And then he was working in cahoots with a bookseller in Paris. And suddenly these things start flooding the market in the late 1800s.
Oh, wow.
These miniatures. And a painting by this same artist was once offered to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And they asked Belle de Costa Green for her opinion about whether they should buy it.
Yeah.
And she said, I wouldn't touch that. It doesn't look right to me. There's something about it that just doesn't look I'm not convinced that it's really a 15th century painting.
Mhm,
And she
mhm.
was right. Later on, they did X-ray fluorescence testing to determine the chemical composition of the pigments. And there's a particular green pigment that has a really high arsenic spike,
Yes.
which proves that it's a 19th century chemically produced pigment as opposed to a natural medieval
Yeah.
pigment.
Yeah.
And so the Spanish forger got away with this for decades, and there are hundreds of these things out there. I own one. I purchased one a few years ago because it was a fake.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
why we bought it. But I definitely encountered manuscripts that have been sort of gussied up, that have
Mhm.
had illustrations added in the margins or decoration, or had
Mm.
miniatures added that were meant to make them more valuable.
Yeah.
They're not always obvious. You sometimes really need
A trained eye. Yeah.
right. And I'm not by training an art historian. I have to do a little art history as part of the study of manuscripts, but I'm
Sure.
really not a trained art historian. And so when I encounter
Yeah.
something that I think looks not quite right, then I reach out to my art historian buddies and get their feedback.
Yeah, and I think that's something too that, we were talking about kind of manuscript survival and how it's probably a small fraction of kind of what was produced actually during the period that we call the Middle Ages. But even then, at least in my experience, most of the manuscripts that I look at are grubby, dingy things.
Yeah.
Like they are not full of illustrations or anything like that. They're kind of on old, worn parchment. It was clearly, just like
Well,
they were writing
that's
stuff
because you
down.
made the wrong choice. You
I
made the wrong
know, I
choice
know.
about
I'm
what
looking
field
at
to get into.
dry theological texts, but
I mean, I love the 11th, 12th century monastic stuff because that was my dissertation too. I was writing about 12th century monastery in Austria and what's now Austria. But you're right, the grubby ones are sometimes more interesting. However, one of the interesting things about the whole corpus of early European manuscripts in North America is that we have more than our fair share of sparkly, pretty,
we do.
fancy books, because those were the ones that the early collectors wanted.
Yeah.
They didn't want that. You have to go to Europe to look at that Ectornox stuff, right?
That's right.
Unless it's, something that was like made for, an Ottonian emperor or something, in which case it's at the Morgan. But generally speaking, those early monastic manuscripts were not the things that those collectors wanted. They're not gold. They don't have a lot of decoration in them. I think they're beautiful. I love that script. I love 11th, 12th century Germanic origin, that Romanesque script. It's so beautiful. It's so easy to read. And then we get into Gothic, and then it's all chaos and things. You can sort of see where Petrarch was getting at about Gothic script.
I hadn't thought about it this way, but I think, most of my academic focus is really defined by Carolingian minuscule, is like, because I don't want to deal with Merovingian script and I don't want to deal with the Gothic stuff. So.
Oh, the Merovingians are fun. They have all those crazy
fun,
ligatures.
But that Merovingian script, please, listener, Google it. No, thank you. No, thank you for me. So.
Oh, my Lord. I teach Latin paleography at Rare Book School in Charlottesville every summer. And that's sort of my favorite are the pre-Caroline, because it's this puzzle to try and figure out what the heck does that even say and what are they thinking? But when you look at the whole story of the development of Latin script, you can really see where those origins are, right?
Absolutely.
Like we start in Rome with Roman cursive, which is terrifying and makes paleographers, it gives us hives. But once you kind of get an eye for it, you can see those through lines from Roman cursive to the Merovingian and Visigothic to Caroline to Romanesque. And then all of a sudden we have that sudden change to Gothic when, the whole aesthetic changes.
Yeah.
From these kind of smooth, rounded scripts to this very kind of pointy, aggressive way of forming letters. It's like the transition from like a Romanesque cathedral to a Gothic cathedral, right?
Yeah.
That's all part of the same aesthetic.
Part of the same aesthetic. And, this is why, I mean, just to bring it back to the modern world, to America for a minute, is that some of the kind of hand-wringing today about kids these days and not being able to kind of read things because they're brought up on tablets and stuff like that. Like, I'm very kind of sanguine about that. It's because hands change, scripts change, like people learn different things. And it's going to be hard in that transitional moment. And we're kind of in that, but we'll figure it out. Like people will learn things.
Right.
And
we've survived the kind of technological and aesthetic transitions in book history before.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it's not the end of the world.
It's not.
It's the beginning of a new world.
There you go. That's a much more positive spin. I mean, apocalypse means unveiling, transformation,
I'm very optimistic.
right? So,
that's right, exactly. Yeah. But you can kind of see, you know, when you think about how in the 11th and 12th century, we had these beautiful Romanesque scripts. And of course, the reason that we think they're beautiful and legible is because there's a direct line from those scripts to Times New Roman, right? That's the reason why we find them legible. Yeah. And we don't find Gothic textualis particularly legible because it's what Petrarch was trying to get over.
That's right.
You know, when he came along. And as we know, it's all Petrarch's fault.
I know you're sounding just like David Perry right now. So he just, we'll have you guys on sometime and you can complain about Petrarch together for just an hour.
Please.
I'll just have a drink and you guys can just yell about Petrarch.
Yes, I love that idea.
He deserves all the scorn. So at least on this podcast, he does.
Yep.
Join the Party will soon be no more, so it's time to catch up on the podcast. After 9 years, the crew are hanging it up, so check out this multitude show and get in on the action. As GM Eric and the emphatic players Amanda, Brandon, and Julia welcome everyone to the table. The current campaign is a superhero high school, but you can also check out their back catalog. Pirates, bugs, superheroes, wizards, elves, and then the stuff that they talk about on the campaigns. Head over to jointheparty.com or search for it wherever you find your podcasts. I do want to ask about one specific manuscript, if I can, to transition over there to... So there is this thing called the Voynich Manuscript. And there it is. It doesn't work on audio so well.
In facsimile.
Yes. In facsimile. Okay. So yes, you have not stolen the actual manuscript.
I do not have the actual Voynich manuscript in my house.
Could you maybe just very briefly kind of explain, like, what is the Voynich manuscript? Why are people so kind of obsessed with it?
And so they are. Well, so the Voynich stands right at the intersection of all the things that interest me about medieval manuscripts in North America, right? It is such a great example of all of this, right? It comes to the United States in 1912, brought here by Wilfrid Voynich, who was a bookseller in New York City, very successful purveyor of manuscripts and printed books. And he immediately sees it as this great opportunity in America where we've got all this new money rolling around and all of these rich guys they're all guys who, they're not all guys, but mostly guys are trying to establish their bona fides, of good European stock by owning these objects, right? The art, not just the books, but the paintings and the furniture and the building themselves castles like Hearst. And so the Voynich manuscript just fits right into that zeitgeist. And it's this object, it's totally unique in terms of survivals. Maybe there were more and they're just been destroyed. And it's written in an alphabet or a symbol set that is totally unique. It doesn't look like anything that anyone has ever seen before. It's about 30 different characters, so it is sort of in the Goldilocks zone of what could be an alphabet. Okay. But the real thing about this manuscript that grabs people are these illustrations. You've got about half the manuscript is full of these crazy plants that people have spent decades trying to identify. I think maybe the artist was just not very good, and they're not really meant to represent, whatever they're meant to represent is not obvious. But then you've got these star charts and fold-outs. It's very manipulatable. And, when you get star charts into the picture, then, of course, you're really going to get the people who want to talk about the aliens because these are not constellations that we recognize in the sky. So, therefore, must be aliens.
I watched a History Channel show about that one time.
So, about the Voynich or about aliens?
No, just about aliens. Everything.
Okay. Because I have been on the History Channel to talk about the Voynich manuscript. I'm sorry to say. I figure if it's not me, they're going to get some crazy person. So
they're going to get somebody else. That's right.
I would rather it be me. And then we have these zodiac signs in the middle of these pages. And then the best bit are the naked ladies because it always comes back to naked ladies here in these pools of water doing, who knows? Nobody knows. But there are diagrams that look like human internal organs. Here's one that looks an awful lot like a uterus and fallopian tubes.
Okay.
So there's this whole sense of it being maybe some kind of a scientific or medical compendium. It feels to me, and I know I shouldn't talk about my feelings because feelings aren't the same as facts, and I'm trying to be factual,
but we're on a podcast, Lisa. Like, this is a fact-free zone right here.
Oh, good. Okay. In that case, in my heart, what I want this to be is a book of women's wisdom made by women for women. That's what I really hope it turns out to be.
Okay.
I have no evidence other than my own psychological connection with the manuscript. I'm kidding. I do not actually have a psychological relationship with this manuscript. I do anthropomorphize it. I've gendered it. I refer to it. If I have seen it in person, I've studied it maybe a dozen times at the Voynich Library at Yale, and I do refer to it as she.
Okay.
I realized that the last time I was with it, I said, "How are you, girl? How you doing, girlfriend?" We're old friends. I first met the manuscript for the first time when I was in grad school at Yale in my Latin paleography class. Bob Babcock pulled it out to show to us, and it's kind of come in and out of my life ever since. And now I've actually done a lot of work on it. I'm not a cryptologist. I'm not a linguist. You got to stay in your lane, which is one of the most important advice I could give anyone who wants to study this manuscript. You got to stay in your lane. And so, but I'm collaborating with linguists and computer scientists and various other people. I have this whole international gang of Voynichologists that I'm collaborating with. I did work a few years ago to establish that there were 5 different hands in the manuscript. So I put my paleography skills to work.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah.
I had this revelation one day where I was reading something about it, and I saw people were saying, we really don't know how many scribes actually wrote this book. No one really knows. And I thought, I'm a paleographer. This is the job I was born to do. And so that's what I did. I spent several years actually studying the handwriting in great detail and eventually established, to my satisfaction, not everyone agrees with me, of course, that there were 5 scribes. But the next piece of that is that the way the scribal work is distributed codicologically, so across the structure, if you take the scribes and you kind of map them onto the structure, you discover that the book is almost certainly misbound, that the bifolia are all out of order. And that's because the nested bifolia vary by scribe. And that's just not the way that manuscripts work. And so now I'm working with a computer scientist at the University of Malta who has come up with a way to analyze text that is without having to know what the content means semantically. It looks at context and spelling and grammar and gives you a similarity score between 2 pieces of text. And we're using that method right now to try and hypothesize what the original order of the bifolia was in the Voynich manuscript. And that, once we do that, then we kick it back over to the linguists and let them get back to work on the cryptology piece.
Yeah, and that's super interesting because I think that's probably something that many of our listeners kind of aren't aware of, is the way that we see medieval manuscripts today are oftentimes not the way that they were constructed in the past in any way, shape, or form, right?
Exactly.
That there might be modern rebindings. And because there are usually what you're talking about with kind of folia, right, are kind of folded pieces of vellum that are together bound into small kind of sets of sheets, like they can be moved around. And so maybe, sometime in the 19th or 20th century, they were kind of loose and then they were kind of put together, or they were intentionally put together, and we just don't necessarily know at this period.
Yeah, exactly. And I've got a lot Voynich going on this year.
Year of Voynich.
Yeah. I've got 2 lectures coming up in New York this month.
Okay.
One at the Yale Club and one at the Bibliographical Society of America. Then I'm going to be speaking at Kalamazoo and Leeds about this work. And then I've got 3 articles coming out and 2 books. I'm writing 2 books about it.
That is a full year. My goodness.
It's a lot of stuff going on. And I actually have 3 book contracts that I'm working on at the moment because I'm stupid. One of them, I'm writing a textbook for manuscript studies.
Okay.
Which I'm really enjoying that process. That's been really satisfying. But the Voynich books, one of them is a collection of kind of latest research essays by a bunch of different people that I'm co-editing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is I'm writing a book for teenagers with a friend of mine. And I went to a college reunion not long ago. I went to Brown undergrad, and I was at my reunion, and I reconnected with a friend from freshman year. I said, "What do you do now?" Her name's Carolyn DeCristofano. And I said, she goes, "Oh, I write STEM books for kids. What do you do?" And I told her, and she said, "Is there some crazy manuscript we could write a book about together?" And I was like, let me think. And so that's what we're doing. We're writing this book for teenagers that's secretly, the book is about critical thinking and the importance of evidence-based research, but it's disguised as a Voynich book.
That's fantastic.
But the point of the book is don't just jump to conclusions. Let's look at the evidence.
Yeah.
And here's all the different kinds of evidence that we can consider when we're looking at any medieval manuscript, but the Voynich in particular. And that's going to be coming out with Getty Press.
Oh, that's fantastic.
The Getty Museum is publishing it probably, I think, next year.
Oh, the Getty's doing such great stuff, aren't they?
Yeah. Really, it's been such a joy to work on. And my co-author, Carolyn, is such a great writer for the age group. She did ask me, you started out by, you were joking before we started recording about, when was the Middle Ages anyway? And she asked me to give her 500 words in answer to that question. That would be like a sidebar in the book for 7th grade reading level.
Yes.
That's really hard.
It's really hard. Yeah.
It's really hard. I managed, so I got my 500 words, and you run it through a Lexile calculator that tells you what the reading level is. And so I ran my first draft through, and it was like 18th grade. Okay, so no indirect sentences, no big words. I love big words. I had to get rid of my 5-syllable words and use 2-syllable words. It's, it took a long time, but it was a really interesting exercise. I managed to get it down to 2nd semester of 7th grade. And then I said, all right, I'm kicking it back to you, Carolyn. You can take it from here. But it was a really interesting exercise.
It's a phenomenal exercise, and I think it's something that we as scholars oftentimes talk ourselves out of our ability to do, is to communicate these things. But we do it kind of all the time. I had a similar experience, not with a book necessarily, but I was asked to talk to a high school. And it was like 9th graders, so, very much at the beginning of high school. And then one of the students asked me, kind of, what is feudalism? And then I said, well, it's kind of this. And then, but there's problems about this. And we don't, scholars don't like to talk about.
Well, I'm glad they asked you. You're the right person to ask.
Yeah. But then they asked me okay, so it's not feudalism. What is it? What do you explain? So I had to do that within the context of a whole bunch of kind of not super paying attention 9th graders. And they kind of got it, or at least they seemed kind of engaged, and the teacher was very grateful for me being able to explain it. And but if you said that to me, you're going to have to go into a room of, 30 9th graders and explain what feudalism is and what the problems scholarly are with that term generally, I would have walked into the woods and then kept walking until you couldn't find me.
Well, but of course, depending on the group of 9th graders, I mean, I have found that kids today are remarkably open to this kind of rethinking.
Oh, yes.
To the understanding of why the kind of 19th century concept of the Middle Ages is a problem.
Oh, absolutely.
They get it right away. It's the old people like us who are kind of stuck in our ways.
Exactly.
I get email almost every day. In my job as director of the Medieval Academy from someone saying, why don't we talk about the Ottonians anymore? Why don't we talk about the Roman Empire anymore? I quit. You're too woke for me.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I also get people complaining about the opposite, but that's just the nature of the beast.
That's the nature of the job. No, and I think you're right. The problem is not the people who are interested in the Middle Ages. It's us. We're the ones sometimes as scholars talking ourselves out of our ability to do this type of communication, right? And that you have this the way that you just described kind of the work that you're doing with Voynich, you're doing at a much more intensive level, but oftentimes there's many other scholars who work on manuscripts who like in order to solve some sort of puzzle that they have set for themselves to figure something out, is just to deal with a manuscript, right? You need to know like something about the vellum that was created on, the hand that it was written on, the type of ink that was used sometimes, because that could be indicative of different scribal hands, right? The way that it was bound, the provenance of it, which leads you into 19th century or 20th century history and all that. Like, it's really super interesting. And like we do all these things, but being able to just talk about it like normal human beings, sometimes I think we can do it, and we do it all the time, but we talk ourselves out of our ability to do it all the time.
I love to do that. I love to talk to people who know nothing about manuscripts and kind of get them jazzed up about these ancient objects. They're four-dimensional objects in that they have this, three-dimensional existence, but then they have moved through space and time.
Yes, they have, absolutely.
To get to where they are today.
Yeah.
And walking that backwards can be a really satisfying journey. You get a lot of dead ends. It's very rare that you find a manuscript where we know where it has been every step of the way.
Yeah.
Even the Voynich, we don't really know where it was before about the year 1600 when it shows up in Prague. And then we know exactly where it was. From Prague, it gets sent to Rome to the Jesuits, because, of course, the Jesuits were into it. Athanasius Kircher owned it, and then a whole series of Jesuits at the library in Rome until Voynich buys it and brings it to New York. And so we have this really clear provenance from about 1600. But before that, we just don't know.
Yeah.
We have no idea. We may never know.
There's got to be that kind of humility before our research, right? It's just to be like,
for sure.
Maybe we'll find out, but we might just have to be okay with just kind of not knowing.
And one thing that's interesting about Voynich discourse is that there were a lot of people who are convinced it's a modern forgery.
Sure.
Which it isn't. I'm here to tell you there's just absolutely no way that you would have to get too many things right to forge a whole book. It's one thing to forge a painting or a miniature in a manuscript, but you'd have to get the binding and the threads and the provenance, and there's just too many things, right, that you would have to get exactly right. And that is one of the things that people get really worked up about, is this question of is it real or is it not? And one of the arguments is that, well, we don't have a provenance for it that goes back all the way, so therefore it must be fake, right? But these are people who haven't spent 30 years studying hundreds of medieval manuscripts.
Yeah.
It would be suspicious if we did have a complete provenance trail for a ratty manuscript like this. That I would find suspicious.
Yeah, sometimes the evidence is too clear, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and for almost all manuscripts, we just don't know. We don't know where they're from. We don't know who wrote them. Mr. and Ms. Anonymous are the most popular writers of the Middle Ages. We just have no idea.
Yeah.
We just don't know who they are.
I love what you said about manuscripts being a fourth dimensional object, too, about moving through time and space, because I think sometimes when we think about them, at a very superficial level, we know they exist now. Like they're in a manuscript in a library somewhere or an archive or something like that. And then they were created at some point in the past, but they had lives, and they must have had lives, right? Like
That's
that
right.
moved them sometimes, across 1,000 and more years.
Oh, yeah.
And so like, what does that really mean? And what did it mean to the people who encountered it? How did the manuscripts change over that time and stuff like that?
And I find it very humbling to think that I'm just a piece of this manuscript's history now.
Yeah.
The manuscript is going to keep going long after I'm dead.
Yeah.
God willing, the manuscript just keeps flowing through space and time. I'll tell you one I just bought myself. So I have a small collection of things, and I just bought something for myself that I just am so excited about and so moved by. It's a fragment that was written by the scribe I wrote my dissertation on.
Really?
And I know his handwriting so well that I spotted it at auction and bought it. And being able to say this object that is now, it's on that shelf right there, that is now in my home in Boston on that bookcase, started out in 12th century Austria. And then it was in Switzerland, and then it was sold in Germany, and then it was in Charlottesville. It was owned by Marvin Kolker.
Okay. All right.
Who then sold it, and then it ended up in Berlin, and then it was in London. And then I went and I picked it up from the seller who bought it on my behalf, and I couriered it home. And I definitely wept when he handed it to me, just thinking about what that little scrap has been through over the course of its life
Yeah.
to end up in my home in Boston. I just find that so powerful and so moving. It's really a thrill for me. And of course, the monk who wrote it, his name was Gottschalk. I mean, he could never even have imagined 900 years later that anyone would know his name, or much less be paying attention to his work. It's sort of the vagaries of that which survives.
Yeah. The humility before our sources, I think, is something that's really valuable and cherished. And, we lose it sometimes, but I think when at its best, when we think about the past and the humanity of the people in the past, like that guy Gottschalk, like he was a person, like he did things in the past. He lived, he had feelings, he had, physical movements and stuff like that. And he sat at a little kind of lectern and he wrote on that little piece of vellum that is now in your house. Like that's amazing. That's amazing.
It's thrilling to me. Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. This is why the Middle Ages are the best to study.
Yep, it's magic.
It is.
It's all magic.
The Middle Ages are magic, but not in that way.
The Voynich is not.
That's right. Yeah, that's a particularly inappropriate thing for me to say when we're talking about the Voynich, but that's okay. I mean, we were talking about aliens and mystical women and stuff like that. But this has been really fantastic. We are unfortunately kind of running towards the end. So if people do want to learn more about you or your work, where can they find you online? Not to send you theories about the Voynich, but to ask other very interesting, penetrating questions.
I get them every day. I get one. And that's because ChatGPT tells people, if you ask ChatGPT, what should I do with my Voynich solution? It literally says, send it to Lisa Fagin Davis. So please don't do that because I won't read it. I don't have time in my life to do that.
Nobody's got time for that. Yeah.
No, nobody's got time for that kind of nonsense. So if you go to manuscriptroadtrip.wordpress.com, you will find my blog and a bunch of links to external things and resources that I've written and projects that I'm working on. So my blog is probably the best place to start. And go look up your own state, look up your hometown, and see where the manuscripts are.
That's right.
You will almost certainly be surprised to discover that there are, in fact, medieval manuscripts not far from you.
A little bit of the Middle Ages right here.
Exactly. There are more than 50,000 manuscripts and fragments in North America.
One might even say an American medieval. You're welcome.
One might indeed.
Ba-boom. There you go. We'll have to put in a rim shot kind of sound effect there.
I think so.
Anyway. All right. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really wonderful conversation and a delight. So please go, again, don't send Lisa anything. Tell ChatGPT to just, fuck off and don't send her anything. Well, just tell ChatGPT generally to F off. But
well, yes. And go visit medievalacademy.org. and learn about the Medieval Academy of America and what we're doing and why you should be part of this great organization.
And anybody can become a member, am I correct?
Absolutely.
You bet. And you can learn all about cool medieval stuff that's happening all over the country. So
yep.
Thank you again, Lisa. And thank you, everyone, for listening. To all of our listeners, thank you again for listening to another episode of American Medieval. Have a great week, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiaffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.